Well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful, wonderful welcome and introduction. It is my great pleasure to be speaking in my hometown. Yes. I want to thank Town Hall Seattle and University of Washington Bookstore for putting on this event, and I especially want to thank all of you for taking the time to come out on this cold night. Several of my friends from our days back at Shoreline High School and even Cordell Hull Junior High School are here this evening. I particularly want to thank two people in the audience without whom I wouldn't be here. The first is my mother, Eunice Unger, who is today celebrating her 90th birthday. And the second is my friend since those Cordell Hull days, Mary Wisner. It was Mary who suggested I might try for a talk in Seattle. And it was Mary who expertly edited every word of this book's manuscript and edits everything that I write. I am thrilled that my mother and Mary can be here tonight, as well as all of you. So let's begin. In 1908, Lydia Adams Williams represented the views of many women when she proclaimed, "Man has been too busy building railroads, constructing ships, engineering great projects, and exploiting vast commercial enterprises to take the time necessary to consider the problems which concern the welfare of the home and the future." Her contemporary, George Knapp, represented the prevailing male view when he called assertions like hers unadulterated humbug, and dismissed conservationists' dire predictions as, quote, baseless vaporings. According to Knapp, men should be praised, not criticized, for turning forests into villages, mines into ships and skyscrapers, scenery into work. Now, I don't believe that women are more inherently protective of the environment than men are. So how and why did such gender divides develop, and to what impact? Those are some of the questions that I answer in my new book. And it was really hard to pick what excerpts to present tonight, because my book includes Native Americans, colonists, enslaved field workers, pioneers, homemakers, municipal housekeepers, immigrants, hunters. Now, I must stop at this one of the woman mountain goat hunting here in Washington. I do not recommend climbing a mountain wearing a long skirt while carrying a loaded gun. I include nature writers, soil conservationists. This is the We Say What We Think Club, whose radio program included advice on soil conservation. Scientists, migrant laborers, interned Japanese Americans, lesbian separatists, nuclear protesters, environmental justice activists, and more. But in the interest of time, I'm going to pick up the story with the overland journey to the West in the mid-1800s. Now, the trip was nearly always planned at the instigation of a man or men. Many were responding to the calls by Horace Greeley, quote, "If any young man is about to commence the world, we say to him, publicly and privately, go to the West. There your capacities are surely to be appreciated and your industry rewarded, for land and freedom lay to the West." Peter Burnett, the future governor of California, provided this added incentive. Quote, The pigs are running around under the great acorn trees, round and fat, and already cooked, with knives and forks sticking in them, so you can cut off a slice whenever you are hungry. Now, women had good reason to be less enthusiastic than their husbands about making this journey west, and not because they were fussy princesses. Most routes westward could include rivers, deserts, and mountains. Men tackled these challenges while in their physical prime, as did women, but physiology as well as gender made women view this map differently. They walked or rode in wagons across the country and faced its obstacles while experiencing menstrual cycles, or pregnant, or having just given birth. And some lucky women experienced all three of these conditions at various points in a single journey. Keep in mind that the disposable sanitary pad was not mass-produced until 1919, and that on the trail, childbirth could take place at the most inconvenient and dangerous times and places, halfway up a mountain pass or during a hailstorm. Any inclination to stop for more than a day to accommodate a woman's labor and recovery was trumped by fears of Indian attacks, the need to reach grazing land and gather fuel supplies, and the specter of being trapped by an early snowfall. Even over relatively smooth trails, travelers would attach a churn to the front of the wagon and fill it with cream, and the jarring motion of the wagon over the course of the day was sufficient to produce butter, but was also extremely uncomfortable for any woman who had just given birth. More than physiology, however, determined women's attitudes and experiences on the trail. 18-year-old Molly Sanford revealed many internalized qualities of what women were told made them true women. She had enjoyed the benefits of schools, churches, and the best of society in Indiana. She knew she would be deprived of all of these in the wild, unsettled country, but deemed it her womanly responsibility, she said, to not shirk from unpleasant and untried realities. She nevertheless spoke of the sadness of my heart, for she and her best friend, quote, wept as only loving friends can weep, to think we must part, perhaps forever. Now, most boys and men would also miss their friends, but friends were less integral to their identities. Riding in the shade of her prairie schooner on the first day of travel, Sarah Herndon lamented, "Why have we left home, friends, relatives, and loved ones who have made so large a part of our lives and added so much to our happiness?" Or as one bitter young woman put it, "What will men not do for money? I would rather be very poor and live where I could see the bright streams and green hills of old Pennsylvania." But her father was bent on improving the family's material status. Anna Shaw remembered well her mother's response to the log cabin that would become their home on the Michigan frontier. Quote, "Something within her seemed to give way. She sank upon the ground. She buried her face in her hands, and in that way she sat for hours without moving or speaking. Never before had we seen our mother give way to despair." Other women broke into tears when they saw the crude structures that were the culmination of their long trek away from family and the familiar comforts of the East. A 17-year-old bride took in her new home's mud floor and dirt roof and then proclaimed with indignation, "My father has a much better house for his hogs." When Debbie Allen, newly arrived on the frontier, learned that a panther was menacing the area, she cried to her husband, "This is a terrible region. Do, Peter, let us go back home." But like other wives, she had no choice but to stay. Not surprisingly, depression plagued frontier women. Many women on the frontier saw themselves as crucial to the civilizing of the wilderness, a task some took on with great relish. So the brooms and the silver pot here under the china cup. All right. They saw themselves as nature's housekeepers. When Lorena Hayes first arrived in California, she observed that both its physical and moral environments required a woman's touch. California, quote, needs the hand of cultivation and art to render it still more beautiful, to strip off its barren and somewhat unclothed appearance, to give its valleys and mountains a finishing stroke of beauty, a home-like charm and attractiveness. A generation later, many women saw their civilizing role as one of wilderness protection. In 1892, Bellingham, Washington poet and naturalist Ella Higginson charged that men who valued profit over beauty wanted to, quote, tear down our forests, rip open our mountainsides, blow out our stumps with giant powder, dam up our waterways, and see in our wide, sea-weeded tidelands only magnificent places for slaughterhouses, by God, and in our blue, shining sea only so much water that at ebb tide would carry off the filth, you know. Pioneering educator and psychologist Stanley Hall claimed that women like Higginson suffered from, quote, effeminization, because caring for nature is female sentiment, not sound science. Even some men were criticized for promoting wilderness preservation. John Muir was a prime target, seen here elaborately clothed in a dress, apron, and flowered bonnet, fussily and fruitlessly attempting to sweep back the waters flooding Hetch Hetchy Valley. By 1910, Muir's crusade to preserve the glories of the valley in its natural state was supported by 150 women's clubs nationwide. San Francisco city engineer Marsden Manson spoke for many when he described Hetch Hetchy's defenders in thinly veiled homophobic terms as short-haired women and long-haired men. Most middle-class men, the sole breadwinners for their families, found the idea that resources should be preserved rather than exploited to be not just wasteful, but unpatriotic, not only feminine, but downright dangerous. Philosopher William James' 1906 treatise, The Moral Equivalent of War, urged that young men not be drafted into the military. Instead, by mining coal and iron, fishing commercially, building roads, digging tunnels, and working in foundries and stokeholes, men will have paid their blood tax, done their part in the immemorial human warfare against nature. Well, despite such assertions, some women's sentimental approach to nature earned them grudging respect, if not outright admiration. According to Clara Burdett, the first president of the California Federation of Women's Clubs, established in 1900, a lot of money-making wood sawers would have split up our giant sequoias, pride of the world, into toothpicks and lead pencils if we women hadn't caught them at it and raised such a shriek that the men couldn't help hearing. Ever so many things like this we are doing. And the best of it all is we've got the men interested by letting them believe that they thought of it first. And they're doing it all. And we are getting ever so much help and good work out of them just by letting them hold the lines and shout at the team while we drive. Seriously speaking, We believe that organized womanhood has so impressed itself on the Commonwealth that good men court our helpfulness and active strength in all reforms that make for higher moral standards and the protection of the home, and that bad men fear the power of an organized force that demands, through public opinion, pure homes, clean life, clean politics, and pure religion, the only sure basis for continued prosperity. But women aren't always the good guys in this story. At the turn of the last century, women's hats featured lavish displays of feathers. Proclaimed one fashion magazine, "The extremely softening effect is ever desirable, especially for ladies no longer young." It has been conservatively estimated that in the late 19th century, 5 million birds a year were killed throughout the world for their feathers. In addition, some species, such as the passenger pigeon, were hunted for sport and pig feed. There had been an estimated 3 to 5 billion, billion with a B, passenger pigeons in the United States prior to European colonization. But in 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in captivity within weeks of the death of the last Carolina parakeet, which was hunted into extinction for its striking plumage. By 1910, 250 women's clubs were active nationwide, dedicated specifically to the protection of birds and plants. Speeches on the floor of the U.S. Senate fueled the assertions of many preservationist women that men could not be trusted to carry out the crucial task of saving the birds. Missouri's James A. Reed responded to a 1913 bill introduced to protect migratory birds by asking, why should there be any sympathy or sentiment about a long-legged, long-beaked, long-necked bird that lives in swamps and eats tadpoles? Let humanity utilize this bird for the only purpose that the Lord made it for, so that we could get aigrettes, aigrettes are tufts of feathers, so that we could get aigrettes for the bonnets of our beautiful ladies. Reed dismissed the protection of birds as trivial, born out of an overstrained, not to say maudlin sympathy for birds born and reared thousands of miles from our coast, foreign birds. In describing the practice of using birds to decorate women's hats, the chair of the Conservation Committee of the Colorado Federation of Women's Clubs observed, "Each declares the cruel death of the bird, the mercenary spirit of men, and the vanity of women." Most admonitions appeal to maternalism. Aigrettes, for example, were harvested during the breeding season, when the feathers were at the height of their beauty, leaving the parents dead and the young to die of starvation. "Remember, ladies," urged a club newsletter, "that every aigrette in your hat costs the life of a tender mother." The success of the Save the Birds campaign is indicated by the plea from a Colorado legislator to the president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, "Call off your women, I'll vote for your bill." In October 1913, a new tariff act outlawed the import of wild bird feathers into the United States. And in 1918, protections were established for birds that migrated between the United States and Canada. Women continued to wear hats, but decorated with naturally shed ostrich and peacock feathers. Thus, prior to achieving suffrage, women were able to successfully wield legislative influence and, by preserving millions of birds, protect complex and vital environmental relationships from ruin by a powerful American industry. Using similar rhetoric and techniques, women worked to protect forests, lakes, rivers, and a host of other natural resources. Women dominated the teaching profession by the late 19th century, and they were worried about their urban students' alienation from nature. When asked by a New York City school teacher to name a sign of spring, one child replied, "Yes, ma'am. I know when spring is here because the saloons put on their swinging doors." The Boy Scouts of America began in 1910, promising to inculcate urban boys with traditional masculine frontier values and skills. When their daughters were excluded from such experiences, some women, themselves barred from membership in many outdoor organizations, began creating outdoor activities and organizations for girls. Charlotte Farnsworth helped to establish the Campfire Girls in 1911. She embraced outdoor activities because she believed they would reinforce rather than challenge the separate gender spheres. Farnsworth stated unequivocally, "Girls are fundamentally different from boys in their instincts, interests, and ambitions." Luther Gulick, another key co-founder of the Campfire Girls, believed that to copy the Boy Scouts, quote, "would be utterly and fundamentally evil." "We hate manly women and womanly men, but we all love to have a woman who is thoroughly womanly and then adds to that a splendid ability of service to the state. Women have acquired the undesirable trait of independence because they've been sequestered in their homes and therefore need to be taught collective obedience to best prepare for gainful employment, efficient homemaking, and public service." Until 1943, although women served on the board of directors of the Campfire Girls, all of the executive directors were men who shared some vision of Gulick's basic belief that the organization's primary goal was to discourage female independence. Campfire Girls were routinely reminded in one signature song, "Love is the joy of service so deep that self is forgotten." A year after the founding of the Campfire Girls, Juliette Lowe established the Girl Scouts of America. According to their first handbook, the Scout movement, so popular among boys, is unfitted for the needs of girls. A different system is needed to give a more womanly training for both mind and body. A Girl Scout's first duty is to be womanly, for none of us like women who ape men. Scouting adhered to a strict gender divide. Quote, "For the boys, it teaches manliness, but for the girls, it all tends to womanliness. If character training and learning citizenship are necessary for boys, how much more important it is that these principles should be instilled into the minds of girls who are destined to be the mothers and guides of the next generation." To Boy Scouts, the outdoors was a stage on which to rehearse manhood. While, quote, "one of the most important principles to be instilled in Girl Scouts is strict and prompt obedience to laws and orders." Where Boy Scouts were taught to be aggressive in order to become providers and fighters, Girl Scouts were told to go about your business quietly and gently, to never draw attention to yourself unnecessarily, and my personal favorite, never marry a man unless he is in a position to support you and a family. The first wish of the Girl Scout is to make others happy. Even something as seemingly gender neutral as the campfire, the heart of communal rituals for both sexes, held entirely different meanings for children in scouting organizations. Boys were told that the fire stood for the camaraderie of the battlefield, factory, and office. girls learned that fire represented hearth and home. Without the fire of domesticity brought by woman's magic touch, a house is dark and bare and cold. Yes. By 1920, the majority of Americans lived in cities. Organized summer camps gained popularity in the 1920s as an opportunity to provide upper-class urban children with several weeks of sustained exposure to outdoor living. Camps for well-to-do girls promoted ladylike conduct. One motto, let's keep our manners high. But what I find really interesting is that regardless of the stated purpose of Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, and summer camps to inculcate prescribed female values, judging from the enthusiasm of women who participated in all of these in the 20s and far beyond, what they gained was not so much womanliness and obedience, but feelings of freedom, strength, confidence, and a lasting love of the outdoors. The Great Depression challenged women's thrift and skill at conserving household resources. When her family was forced to go on welfare, Violet Cottrell, a Puyallup, Washington homemaker, was proud that her thrift contributed to their survival. Quote, gardens became very prevalent and very important in our life to get nutrition. I canned and preserved up to 1,000 quarts of food every year so that my children, my first thing, got good, nutritious food. I always felt good about that. Following World War II, many Americans recognized both old and new sources of environmental degradation imperiling their nation. Not all environments, however, were deemed equally worthy of preservation and protection. In 1945, Pacific Northwest author Betty McDonald published The Egg and I, which she called a sort of rebuttal to all those recent successful I Love Life books by female good sports whose husbands forced them to live in the country. Unlike the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which appealed to Americans struggling during the Great Depression because they romanticized pioneer hardships and environments, McDonald's was, quote, a bad sports account of the wilderness. When McDonald's husband wanted to take up chicken farming in the Chimacum Valley of Washington's Olympic Peninsula in the late 1920s, she readily agreed, for mother had taught me that a husband must be happy in his work. 2 children later, McDonald discovered that she hated even baby chickens, was lonely, and seemed to have married the wrong man. She left her husband in 1931, returning to Seattle, where she eventually remarried and wrote her account of her 4 years in the wild. First serialized in the Atlantic Monthly, The Egg and I sold more than 3 million copies in hardback and eventually was translated into 32 languages. It was made into a hit film in 1947. McDonald's humor was edgy rather than warm, although she wrote in detail about the natural beauties of the local environment. She also wrote derisively of the privations she endured as a woman in a house without electricity or running water. In addition to the usual domestic chores made all the more difficult without the labor-saving technologies available in cities, she was shocked that rural life required her to share in more masculine labors like hauling wood, water, and chicken feed, and pulling stumps. To McDonald, the phrase, "woman's work is never done," signified the dinner dishes which I washed and dried while Bob, her husband, smoked his pipe and took his ease. She highlighted the gender differences between herself and her husband, noting he never seemed to be lonely. He enjoyed the work. He didn't make stupid blunders, but then, of course, he wasn't pregnant. MacDonald expressed great disdain for the local Indians and wrote in biting wit of the neighboring farmers and ranchers, including the, quote, shiftless, ignorant, and non-progressive cattle family made up of Ma, Pa, and their 15 children. MacDonald's neighbors were not amused. Several sued her for libel. MacDonald countered that the unflattering characters were composites of rural life rather than individual portraits. On the basis of this sweepingly negative stereotype, MacDonald was exonerated. Most Americans shared her dim view of the woman who didn't have lights, water, radio, toilet, bathtub, movies, neighbors, or money, and she just loved it. In the film version of The Egg and I, the hapless characters of Ma and Pa Kettle were a huge hit. Marjorie Main was nominated for an Academy Award for her portrayal of Ma Kettle. An additional 9 Ma and Pa Kettle films were made over the next 10 years, cementing into popular culture the notion of people in contemporary rural environments as unsophisticated, lazy, and simple-minded, yet conniving, holding nothing in common with the noble pioneer past. This theme was perpetuated, as some of you may remember, by the TV show Green Acres, popular in the 1960s and 1970s. People in contemporary rural environments were not the only ones who suffered a setback in the public's esteem. With the Cold War came new, stricter, and more rigid gender prescriptions, many prohibiting women from claiming any environmental authority. In 1950, when American Elizabeth Cowles became the first Western woman to penetrate deeply the southern approach to Mount Everest, American Magazine rushed to reassure its readers that Cowles was a mother and so completely feminine that one would never suspect her stamina and spirit of adventure, noting approvingly that she carried a lipstick in her knapsack. Women mountaineers, whose achievements had been celebrated in previous decades, were described derisively by one noted writer, explorer, and preservationist as, quote, lonely crows aping men. True women are too tender for the rigors of the mountain, and men will not accept that they should penetrate their domain. In the Sierra Club and other major conservation organizations, even women who had previously held office were now routinely relegated to voluntary rather than paid positions. Suburbs transformed the American environment. The gendered consumption patterns of the many newly available and heavily advertised consumer goods aligned suburban women in particular with environmentally harmful practices. Women's daily use of ozone-depleting aerosol hairsprays and deodorants became the norm. New standards of cleanliness and appearance necessitated a wide range of chemical compounds inside each suburban home, garage, and tool shed. Yet the phosphates routinely found in detergents, as well as disinfectants and deodorants, unbalanced ecosystems. The pesticides and weed killers touted as essential to women's beautification of their lawns and gardens made their way into the groundwater. Chemical agents like DDT were marketed aggressively to women and were not feared for their potential toxicity, but embraced as miraculous, time-saving solutions to age-old problems. My favorite, the ladies know what's good, and it's DDT. The testing of nuclear weapons proved that volatile materials could not always be controlled, as when the force of an explosion in a 1954 American test was more than twice that predicted. Many scientists dismissed claims that radioactive nuclear fallout was appearing in both breast milk and commercially produced cow's milk, and thereby finding its way in significant amounts into the mainstream population. In St. Louis, a group of women, Eves against atoms, provided the foundation for the Citizens Committee for Nuclear Information. The group proposed that baby teeth, formed from 1948 to 1953, the first years of the fallout era, be collected and tested to form a baseline for levels of radioactivity. The project sought 50,000 baby teeth and attracted worldwide attention. Its emphasis on babies, milk, and future generations raised the concerns and involvement of mothers everywhere, placing them at the center of this high-stakes scientific controversy and the movement to stop nuclear testing. The rapidly expanding military-industrial complex intensified their fears. On October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union tested the largest nuclear weapon ever. 2 days later, some 50,000, primarily white, middle-class American homemakers abandoned their duties to march and to demonstrate. In this Women Strike for Peace, protesters demanded that the world end the arms race, not the human race. According to co-founder Dagmar Wilson, in the face of male logic, which seemed to us utterly illogical, it was time for women to speak out. An organization of the same name grew out of the strike. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 made the potential for nuclear disaster impossible to dismiss as female hysteria. School children practiced nuclear attack drills, and panicked suburbanites dug bomb shelters in their basements or their backyards. Women Strike for Peace held demonstrations throughout the crisis, emphasizing that their concerns about children and the future trumped any political issues. President John F. Kennedy claimed that the women's generational arguments influenced his thinking, culminating in the U.S.-Soviet test ban treaty. Quote, "I have said that control of arms is a mission that we undertake for our children and our grandchildren, and they have no lobby in Washington. No one is better qualified to represent their interests than the mothers and grandmothers of America." Also in 1962, pioneer ecofeminist Rachel Carson dramatically challenged conventional notions of progress and celebrations of prosperity with her book, Silent Spring. In 1954, Carson had proclaimed, quote, "women's greater intuitive understanding of the value of nature," as she denounced a society blinded by the dollar sign that was allowing rampant selfish materialism to destroy these things. She defended the presence of emotion in science and nature writing. Scolding man for his arrogant talk of the conquest of nature, Carson called Americans stunningly oblivious to the danger of their embrace of all things chemical. Specifically, she questioned the wisdom of the governmental fathers concerning industrial waste and the vast reliance on pesticides, especially DDT. In arguments featuring the traditional female emphasis on beauty, spirituality, and future generations, Carson pointed out long-term consequences of chemical use that far outweighed short-term private profits and consumer benefits. Following its initial surface application, DDT seeped into the soil and water and ultimately into the food chain, ingested by birds and animals, including humans, in whose tissues it caused cancer and genetic damage. The book's title came from the opening chapter, A Fable for Tomorrow, predicting an American town where all life, from songbirds to children, had been silenced by this killer unwittingly unleashed by the scientific community. Carson warned future historians may well be amazed by our distorted sense of proportion. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Carson was dismissed as hysterically overemphatic in a scathing review in Time magazine. Most members of the scientific community, especially those in the chemical industry, initially dismissed her. Ezra Taft Benson, Secretary of Agriculture in the Eisenhower administration, I love this, wondered why a spinster with no children was so worried about genetics. Well, he settled on the only possible conclusion: she was probably a communist. At the same time that Carson's unnatural status was used by some of her critics to undermine her credibility, others criticized her for being all too stereotypically female. A California reader complained to the editor of The New Yorker, "Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies. And as for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs?" Well, when several reputable male scientists rose to defend Silent Spring, President Kennedy ordered his Science Advisory Committee to investigate. Carson's painstaking research was impossible to refute. No longer would the traditionally male emphasis on immediate, market-driven needs to exploit natural resources for profit automatically trump women's sentimental emphasis on future generations. The understanding that any disturbance to the web of life has consequences throughout was accepted by most as a scientific reality. Nevertheless, traditional gender stereotypes continued to undermine women's organizations. A project engineer dismissed a member of a group of California homemakers opposing the construction of a highway with a sneering, "Get back in your kitchen, lady, and let me build my road." Clean air activist Michelle Madoff stated, "I didn't want to go and testify and be branded another idiot housewife in tennis shoes, as we're referred to, you know, uninformed, emotional." Some women downplayed traditional gender stereotypes and joined new, ostensibly gender-neutral mainstream organizations. Others embraced their traditional role as women while borrowing tactics such as political theater used effectively by the student and anti-war movements. So this is from the Women's Pentagon Action in 1980. A growing chorus of women's voices expressed concern that not all scientific advances conform to the DuPont Chemical Company's slogan, "Better living through chemistry." As the feminist movement spread, critics began to recognize that rampant consumerism was rapidly depleting natural resources and poisoning the environment, with women uniquely responsible and at risk. According to activist Donna Warnock, the road to women's liberation lies not only in ousting patriarchy, but also in rejecting its inequitable and environmentally and socially disastrous production system, which is based on man's dominion over women and the earth and the illusion of infinite resources. Elizabeth Dodson Gray warned that more chemicals were found in the average modern home than in the chemical labs of the past, and that many homemakers know little about these chemicals and even less about their toxic and polluting effects. I am told by this consumer culture that my identity is defined by what I have: car, house, fur coat, kitchen appliances, cosmetics, and clothes. I'm supposed to feel good about myself if I have a lot of expensive things. Meanwhile, the TV ads make me feel that I must, as a woman, be lovable at all costs. Men achieve, but women must be loved. And I only will be if I use the latest in floor wax, cosmetics, and vaginal deodorants. During the Vietnam War, homemakers across the nation joined Women for a Peaceful Christmas, denouncing the increasingly frantic holiday season in which women do the vast bulk of the shopping, for generating waste and funding the war. Another group of homemakers formed League Against Nuclear Dangers, known as LAND, in opposition to a proposed nuclear power plant in Rudolph, Wisconsin. On December 1st, 1973, they staged a highly publicized release of red balloons tagged with postcards describing the various radioactive substances that they represented. The cards' finders returned the postcards to Wisconsin from as far away as West Virginia, vividly demonstrating the traveling range of airborne contaminants. The League had been formed earlier in the year by Gertrude Dixon, ridiculed for their lack of scientific credentials and dismissed by utility officials as illogical, emotional housewives. LAND members found that experts paid by the utilities to promote nuclear power, quote, usually had degrees in journalism, communication, business management, or particularly for women audiences, home economics. It occurred to them, if these people can, after a 6-week public relations course, claim to be nuclear experts, then with a little application, so can we. For Dixon, this meant requesting and carefully studying materials by the Atomic Energy Commission. She urged other activists to approach sophisticated materials with confidence. Don't be dismayed by the jargon and the volume of paper. I cannot stress enough the necessity for us to constantly educate and re-educate ourselves. Only through the tortuous route of constant reading, searching, and thinking will we and the public learn. In 1980, the Wisconsin Public Service Commission bowed to widespread opposition, much of it generated by LAND, and canceled plans that had grown to include 8 proposed nuclear power plants. They canceled them all. By the time LAND formally disbanded in 1988, the world had witnessed events that proved the group's concerns were not just emotional vaporings. My book concludes with a chapter on women's roles in the environmental justice movement, which emphasizes the right to safe and healthy ecological, physical, social, political, and economic environments for all people. It includes women like Lois Gibbs, seen here with her 2 children. In the 1970s, she exposed the effects of the toxins buried under Love Canal in New York. Her leadership united her community in a spirited and ultimately successful crusade for accountability from the government and big business. It's a well-known story. But race complicates gender in this story. In October 1979, Governor Hugh Carey announced that the state of New York would purchase Love Canal homes at fair market value, a victory for homeowners that had no provisions for renters. Poor African-American mothers demanded equal protection. We love our kids just like those homeowners over there, and we should have the same protection that the homeowners have. It took until 1997 for all of the area families to move and receive some financial restitution for their loss of health and property. Lois Gibbs became an internationally renowned activist devoted to facilitating citizen involvement at the community level. Women untrained in environmental sciences but passionate about protecting their disadvantaged communities began action groups and protest movements deeply rooted in their local cultures, traditions, and gendered beliefs. African American women in particular, frequently the head of single-parent households, brought a legacy of assertiveness, leadership, and maternal concerns. In conclusion, in the United States and around the world today, women and men work together to protect the environment in thousands of agencies and organizations. Many reject gender-based approaches to environmental problems entirely, deeming them divisive and even demeaning and embarrassing. although they support feminism's ongoing debunking of tired old stereotypes, all women are earth mothers and all men are just greedy pigs, some of these groups do emphasize the connection between the historical oppression of women and the ongoing oppression and exploitation of non-human nature. One of the most promising new trends is recognition of the importance of gender and environment across all times, cultures, and geographic boundaries. Much is to be gained from understanding gender, sex, and environment not as discrete entities, but as elements in a powerful synergy that significantly shapes history and our planet. Thank you very much.